is on the theme of, I have called you by name. Our names define us, and we develop an extraordinary amount of attachment to them. The sound of our own name becomes intrinsic to us, who we are. When I became a Franciscan novice, I chose the religious name of Tobias. And I was surprised how odd it felt at first when people started calling me Tobias, even though it's a name that I love and one that I chose carefully. And I almost grieved for my baptismal name, which is Robert. Where's Rob gone? Was my initial response, even though Rob is me and I'm alive and well. It took a long while to settle into the new sound of my name. And that sound is so personal and important. And it triggers a primal response in us. It's an intimate call to the very foundation of our being. And that's why I always notice when someone mispronounces a name, or why I feel very embarrassed when I do it myself. And forgetting someone's name can also be very embarrassing. I'm sure we've all been in a social situation where we're introducing somebody and their name escapes us. And it feels terrible. It feels like we're lessening the value of the person concerned. Some of us perhaps have even stumbled over or forgotten people's names during intercessions, which feels awful. But in truth, we're all human and we forget things, so we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. So it's truly uplifting, therefore, to remember that God knows every one of us by name and never forgets us. He knows every hair on our head. Catherine of Siena once famously observed, God is closer to us than water is to a fish. There's an immediacy and an intimacy in our connection with the divine, if only we open our hearts to it. I have called you by name, you are mine. What can be more gentle, more awesome than to know that God is on first name terms with every one of us right here, right now? Proximity and connection are the hallmarks of our faith. We have a faith based upon relationship, both the divine relationship between the three persons of the Trinity and our relationships with God and with one another. Now, to dispel any doubt that this is all a modern invention, the language of intimacy, I want to look at some scripture. And first of all, I'm going to begin with a famous scene that you will all know well. Think of Moses in Exodus chapter 3. So this is before the great liberation of the Israelites, when he has fled to the distant land of Midian after killing an Egyptian who had been beating a Hebrew. So he's in exile, he's living as a nomad, tending the sheep of his father-in-law. He's way out in the wilderness at Horeb when he encounters the burning bush. Now, when we ask what were God's first words to Moses, many people might answer that God instructed him to take off his sandals. I'm sure we all remember that. But actually, something happens before that. God calls Moses by name. He does it twice. Moses, Moses. And Moses responds, here I am. God knew Moses by name, just as he knows us by name. And another example. In the first book of Samuel, we learn of the young boy who is given in service to the priest Eli. Samuel becomes a faithful young servant, in contrast to the misdemeanors of Eli's own sons. He's a dedicated child trying his best. In chapter 3, we hear of the remarkable story of Samuel in the temple as night fell, tending the lamp of the Lord by the Ark of the Covenant. And God calls Samuel by name. He does it many times, and it takes Samuel several experiences of this to realize that it is indeed God and not Eli who is calling. God calls Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel responds, "Here I am." God knew Samuel by name, just as he knows us by name. Now, Simon, the fisherman, was drawn to Christ at the very beginning of Christ's ministry. And Jesus even gave him a new name, Peter, the rock on which the church would be built. Now, as we know, Peter was tempestuous, headstrong, but totally devoted to Christ. I don't know about you, but one of the most heartbreaking moments for me in the entire Bible comes when Peter denies Jesus 3 times. The cock crows and Peter weeps bitterly. It just never fails to move me. But then that situation is turned around. In John's Gospel, we hear an encounter between Peter and the risen Christ beside the Sea of Galilee. Jesus switches back to Peter's birth name, which only adds to the emotion. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And in a mirror of the 3 denials, Peter is asked this question 3 times and gives 3 affirmations. God loved and forgave Simon Peter by name, just as he loves and forgives us by name. Now, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, we hear about a Roman centurion called Cornelius living in Caesarea. Now, he was one of the foreign occupiers, coming from a very different religious background, and yet he'd obviously been drawn to the God of the Jews and had begun to pray regularly, perhaps at first awkwardly or even hesitantly. But he'd also realized the importance of generosity towards the poor. One afternoon, to his astonishment, he is greeted by an angel of God to prepare the way for him to hear the gospel through Peter. And this is a crucial moment in history as it sows the seeds of an expansive, multicultural church. And the very first word the angel speaks is Cornelius. Cornelius was called by name, just as we are called by name. So we are precious to God right here and now, just as we are. The Bible is full of the most unlikely encounters in the most unlikely of places. Our God is a God of surprises. But the one thing that shines out in all of this is that we are known and loved. Perhaps sometimes we don't feel worthy of this love. Perhaps it feels more comfortable to transfer the idea of Christian experience onto others. But this misses the point. There is nobody that God doesn't call to the kingdom. We are all loved, and we are all called by name.